On the Friday wrap, we're heading up towards the open line. Morning to you, Joe.
Good morning. Last Saturday there was an article in The Age with the headline "Schools in Crisis as Student Numbers Explode," which was talking about how the Lord Mayor of Melbourne, academics and parents who've been forced out of the inner city and pursued public schools have criticised the department for lax planning in the wake of exploding student numbers. It might not be the biggest article of the week for everyone else, but if you're one of the parents affected, it certainly made an impression on us. The article talked about how, why can we find space for thousands of apartments in the Docklands, but we can't fund a new school? And I think this ties into the issue of commuting times that you were talking about earlier in the program. There's 7,000 residents in the Docklands, many of whom are working mums, who initially moved into the Docklands so they could walk to work.
Are there a lot of families there, Joe?
Oh, huge. In the Docklands area, there are almost 400 primary school aged children. And if you take the Docklands and West Melbourne residential, which is the CBD, there's 679 primary school aged children.
And that was never really how it was set up, though. It wasn't thought to be particularly family friendly other than for tourists.
In fact, that's incorrect. Places Victoria made it a condition as part of their planning that they provided for a school, but the government just hasn't funded it yet. So as a result, the Docklands mums generally have a 40-minute tram trip to send their kids all the way to North Melbourne Primary. So in effect, they've got to take them there, it's 40 minutes, they've got to take them back, they've got to get back, it's 80 minutes. So they've got an 80-minute commute to drop kids at school before they then begin their convenient and environmentally friendly walk to work.
And now you're reminding me that one of the private schools is setting up in the Flagstaff, opposite the Flagstaff Gardens in a high-rise building, which is our first school in a high-rise tower.
And I think that's probably one of the reasons why the Lord Mayor has been so kind of slamming of the dodgy data behind the government's decision to not build a school until 2031. And at the moment, they're saying they're not going to build another school in that North Melbourne, West Melbourne, CBD, Docklands catchment zone until 2031.
Which is going to make things even worse. And, let's put this to the rappers. Dimity, this is a failure by governments given that it's swapping around Labor Liberal over the times that Dockland's been there, both parties have failed to provide for vital infrastructure in a city that's rapidly growing yet again.
Yeah, look, I'd have to agree with that in some ways, John. And I think it's also a symptom of rising house prices. People are looking for affordable housing, and sometimes that is in apartments in the inner city. I think it's a bit too long to wait till 2031, personally, and I think...
quite clearly, if indeed the schools that are still there are bursting.
Yeah, absolutely, and the schools in the vicinity of the CBD have been having space issues for a long period of time. I mean, from what I understand, there's about $1.1 billion in the pipeline for school infrastructure, and I think that's an incredible investment, but we do certainly need to look at the areas of need, and I think those areas of need are definitely around the inner city and also in the growth suburbs on the fringe of the city.
Tim?
So firstly, why don't you go and ask your mate James Merlino? He's the Education Minister. He should be building these new schools. We need 530-odd new schools by 2035. That's what the Grattan Institute says.
Statewide, but specifically Joe's talking about Docklands.
No,
itself.
and that's a fair point that she's made.
And your party...
And the point that I'm making, John, is that the Education Minister, James Merlino, her friend, should be doing something about it.
Well, your party was in office until just 2 years ago, and before that, if you want to go back through the history of Docklands, both parties have been in government at various times. Both have been culpable.
If we want to talk about long-term infrastructure lags, Labor have been government in Victoria for the 11 years out of the last 15, so come on, let's attribute blame appropriately.
Docklands goes back before 15 years, but either way, it's about the transition. A city with growing pains, whether we're talking about railways and tramways and roads and schools, numbers, police stations, it's all the same thing, to which the bottom line is if we won't pay taxes, we can't provide infrastructure.
That is very true, and we want to see a plan. We're growing at 100,000 people a year, the highest growing population in the nation. We want to know what is the government's plan to deal with population growth.
Dimity?
Well, I don't represent the government, and I think it's quite hilarious that Tim seems to think that I do. What I represent is...
You represent the Labor Party, and your friend James Molino's the Education Minister.
I don't even represent the Labor Party. I have centre-left views, Tim, and like you said, you had centre-right views before. I think the point of this is that there are issues, and I think even, can you imagine if we looked at them in a bipartisan way, we might actually be able to get something done. Who would have thought? But I think the first thing to acknowledge is, yes, there is an issue. We've known there's been an issue. I think it's a good thing that there is over $1 billion in the pipeline going into school infrastructure, and that's definitely the start.